Oh, hello! Today we are doing a different kind of commentary video. I was thinking about the question that I often get when I'm talking about nonfiction that is in some ways centered around marginalized groups. That is something that I really enjoy reading in nonfiction. And between that and times where we have had kind of big, horrible, usually events happening that occasion people wanting to learn more about the plight of a certain marginalized group, sometimes questions I get are, how do I learn more about X? Now, one of the things that I think particularly during the summer of 2020, because of the murder of George Floyd, when there was a lot of focus on trying to read about the Black American experience, one of the things that Black creators online were very vocal about was this idea of educating yourself. And that is not true just about that marginalized experience. That's true across the board, right? It is not incumbent upon people in the LGBTQIA+ community to educate people about their experiences. It's not incumbent upon any racial or marginalized ethnic identity to educate other people about their experiences. And it's also not incumbent upon disabled people to educate people about their experiences. And I thought maybe what we could do today is I have been very slowly, but just starting to dip my toes into the process of educating myself more about the experiences of people with disabilities, some of the different sort of like theoretical models of thinking about disability, because I, in the last couple of years, have been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. I am coming to understand my identity as a disabled person in a way that has highlighted to me my own internalized ableism and my ableism towards other people. So I thought that we could maybe use this as a case study of just like the basics of starting to get familiar with different terms around different marginalized experiences, and sort of just like a real life example of me starting to try to educate myself about a group of people's experiences that does not put the onus on actual people that I interact with on a day-to-day basis to educate me about it, but takes advantage of resources that have already been made available from that community and the kinds of things that I look for, the kinds of things that I think are helpful to start that journey. So I want to be clear that this is certainly not me claiming to be an expert on ableism, and really this is me just documenting the beginning of a journey that hopefully, and with my intention, will continue for the rest of my life, really. I mean, that's kind of, it can be overwhelming to realize how little we know about the world and other people's experiences in it. It is overwhelming in some ways, but I also think you can look at it as a source of excitement of the diversity of the human experience, that there's always new things to learn and always new things to think about. So this is by no means the end of a journey, but the beginning of one. And I thought that I could just show you with really three main resources, a kind of beginning journey that I have been on. So let's start with sort of getting the lay of the land on terminology. So when it comes to trying to learn more about a group of people's experiences, I really do, I mean, I know I'm a book channel, so I'm biased, but I don't think you can replace the kind of deep learning that you get from books. So I would definitely recommend when you're getting started to at least start with a couple of books on the topic. And I have picked two that we're going to be featuring in today's video, neither of which is super long. These are both very reasonable lengths to get through. Both of these are available as audiobooks, and this is an essay collection, so it's even more kind of bite-sized, digestible. So I do recommend when you're sort of trying to get the lay of the land, starting with a couple of books. And I picked Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space by Amanda Leduc because this does have a lot of discussion about conceptualizing the disabled experience and conceptualizing ableism. So I think that for that reason, it's a good kind of starter book. But because she's engaging with the topic through the lens of how fairy tales have perpetuated sort of cultural narratives around ableness, I think that that's a sort of interesting angle to it. So it's a little less dry than maybe some kind of more theoretical type books might be. And I also think that the audio on this is really good. So that's why I picked this one. I'm going to be quoting extensively from this book to show kind of the type of material that I think you should look for in this sort of orienting book. But even though I'm quoting extensively from this book, I highly recommend that you go and read it yourself, because what I will be quoting is far from the only thing in this book. It is just what I'm going to be highlighting as a part of this section of the video. So the first thing that she addresses, even in the opening chapter, is language around how we refer to disabled people. So this is a great example of where I think there can be a sort of politicizing, or not even, it's like a partisan approach to language about marginalized communities. I think that this is a great illustration of a nonpartisan way to approach that topic that is really about respectfulness towards people and not about trying to be perfect, trying to get everything right, but engaging with an ongoing dialogue within the community in question about how they want to be referred to. So she says on page 14 and 15, I spoke with many disabled individuals over the course of writing Disfigured, and as a general rule, use identity first language throughout the text unless otherwise requested. So what is identity first language? Identity first language is in contrast to person first language. So she is saying that she is going to be using disabled person rather than person with a disability. The reason why she decides to do this is that that was the kind of consensus from talking to people who are impacted by the experience in question. And also she says, the general consensus among disability activists is that person first language, while well-meaning, separates disability from identity and thus continues to malign disability and perpetuates the idea that it is a negative thing. So there you go. Right in the introduction, when she's explaining how she's going to be talking about some of these matters, we already have an example of two kind of schools of thought about how to talk about this experience. And the reality is that some people would prefer person first language, but she explains her rationale for why she's going to use identity first language and kind of what the underlying theoretical disagreement there is. So then she is going to talk at length about a number of different models, which I want us to discuss. So first she talks about the social model of disability, and the social model of disability holds that the disability of individuals is in fact maintained by systematic barriers, exclusion, and negative attitudes towards these disabilities more than the physical limitations of the conditions themselves. And then she contrasts that model to the medical model of disability, which links a body directly to a diagnosis and places emphasis on the intervention of medicine as a way of solving or eradicating the particular disability or condition. Basically, what the contrast here is that it's not society that needs to be fixed, it's the person who is broken. So I think that those are two helpful framing devices of thinking about the reader's own experience of how they conceptualize disability. But it's also kind of setting in contrast two different sort of suggestions about how disability should or shouldn't be addressed by society writ large. And she gives an example of that, of sort of how the medical model can be really harmful towards disabled individuals. So she says, in the medical model, disability is both a reality of life as well as a kind of storytelling. Every disabled story becomes a narrative, a story that has everything to do with what culture perceives as good, able-bodiedness, beauty, and bad, disability or disfigurement, and how we as a society are supposed to act towards one another, and what society or the higher powers that be will do with us in return.
And so this judgment is really based off of this idea that, and I hate to say it, a lot of people just don't believe we should exist. A lot of people think that anything that we take out into the world and put before us and use to help us is over and extra because we shouldn't be here at all. And we see this in the attitudes that we talk about, the pandemic, our spending habits, every aspect of our lives is put into question and debated all the time. There is a ton of scrutiny for being disabled. But unfortunately for all the people judging, the only thing that separates me from you is luck and time. So right. All these judgments that you are making, all of these ideas that you have about that are better, look around. This is your retirement plan. The society that we built that is not accessible, that is not inclusive, this is what you've got. So you fix it now, you build inclusion now, or you'll be at its mercy later. So all these judgments that you're holding about what we do with our money, what we do with our time and resources, they're not useful to you. So figure something else out.
So those are two models. I was about to launch into a personal reflection on that, but I'm going to save that for part 2. And as she progresses in the book, it becomes clear why she's starting with these two models, because I think they are sort of the two kind of core models that the other ones build off of, but kind of further unpacking why the medical and social models are sort of dichotomous. She's diving in a little bit more to the medical model kind of implications for how you conceptualize disability. So she says, in Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag notes that, quote, modern totalitarian movements have been particularly and revealingly inclined to use disease imagery, end quote. Put another way, the medical model celebrates an individual's triumph over disability, while the social model celebrates society's collective power and responsibility to consider the needs of all, thus making disability an integrated element of the society in which we live. She does also note that there are other kind of emerging theories that use a hybrid of those two models. So she notes that in disability theory, Siebers, whoever that is, advances a theory of what he terms complex embodiment, wherein elements of both the medical and social model guide how the body makes its way through the world. So, as is wont to happen usually when you're starting to try to get language around a marginalized experience, often the sort of two dichotomized models that are early on and brought to light end up sort of mixing together, and usually what academics start kind of theorizing or talking about is the fact that very few things in life are purely one thing or the other. They're often sort of a mix of both. So the complex embodiment is a model that reflects that element. There's two other models that she then goes into that I think are both, one of which she specifically identifies as an offshoot of the medical model, but I think that they both kind of are. So the charity model shares similarities with the medical model of disability in that the disabled person is once again seen as flawed, as someone in possession of a less than perfect body, a disfigured body, someone who is set apart from society as a result of these differences. In each case, the disabled person is at the mercy of others. So in the medical model, medical professionals are the experts who can help the disabled individual and ultimately, hopefully, eradicate the disability. In the charity model, the disabled person is someone to be pitied and saved by both medical and social establishments. She then will talk about a different model. I think the intersection of these two models is the idea of inspiration porn. But the next model that I think combined with the charity model gives us inspiration porn is the psychological model. And this is a variant of the medical model. Again, she's quoting Susan Sontag, who says, psychological theories of illness are powerful means of placing blame on the ill. Patients who are instructed that they have unwittingly caused their disease are also being made to feel that they have deserved it. Nothing is more punitive than giving a disease a meaning, that meaning invariably being a moralistic one. And I think the one in particular that resonates here, she says, your disability is causing you pain, do yoga. Struggling because of mental health issues, meditate. The more you focus, the more you improve, and the less society at large needs to worry about having different kinds of dance classes or accessible entryways or accessible bathrooms or clearly marked accessible parking, to say nothing of captions or ASL or quiet rooms that offer respite from external stimuli. So basically, the implication of the psychological model being you kind of brought this on yourself, or this is kind of in your head. I think of something like anxiety as being a great example of something that I think myself included, we have ableist narratives around that tend to place the onus of the illness back on the individual rather than treating it as the debilitating mental illness that it is. I think mental illness probably in general is prone to a psychological model. So ultimately, I do think that Leduc at least is advocating for a social model of understanding disability, potentially a complex embodiment model. She says on page 211, in this landscape, the disabled person is choosing the way to bring about their own fulfillment, aided by a society that helps to ensure this happiness by likewise ensuring that different options for happiness are supported and encouraged, which I think is also pretty resonant to a lot of marginalized groups' ultimate aim, which is like, hey, I should just be allowed to be happy, and we should have a society where if I'm not happy, it's not because I'm a part of this marginalized identity. So that kind of gives you some of the models. I think in contrast to that, what are these models trying to address? Well, they, I think, are trying to address our understandings of disability, and I think what disabled activists would then want to translate that to is using our understanding of disability to deconstruct ableism, which is a term I've used a few times now. So what is ableism? Leduc quotes Talia A. Lewis. Talia A. Lewis's definition of ableism is, ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence. These constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and excellence are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on people's appearance and/or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, and quote-unquote behave. So that's how Talia Lewis defines ableism. And then internalized ableism would be you being a disabled person and subconsciously or even sometimes consciously having those ableist thoughts about your own experience. So I think a couple of sort of further expansions on what ableism looks like. She quotes Tobin Siebers when he says, disability has served throughout history to symbolize other problems in human society. I should note that that's a lot of what she's doing in this book, is talking about how fairy tales represent ableism to express discomfiture with other parts of society. So that's kind of the project of her book writ large. Then she says, we turn disability into a symbol because it has been socialized as not useful, a burden on society, an uncomfortable ending. You've been watching my commentary videos, you know I definitely have thoughts about Protestant work ethic in America and generally kind of how we conceptualize usefulness or productivity or the value of work. So I think that really resonated with me. Anyway, she continues and says, if disability is instead seen in a story as a metaphor, there is a potential for the happy ending as the able-bodied world knows it to be truly achieved. If a disability is not a disability so much as a symbol of something else, then once that symbol is realized, the disability can go away. So that's sort of a conceptual idea of why ableism is so socially powerful or socially relevant in people, including myself's construction of disability. And then finally, I think a good example of ableism or an ableist attitude that she gives is, consider the cliche of not letting your disability define you. This is, at the very least, a dressed up version of a military metaphor. If you don't let your disability define you, then the implication is that you've won. You've refused to allow your disability to run roughshod over your life. You've emerged triumphant from the battle and managed to go about your daily business and activities just like everyone else. So those are some relevant parts of this particular book that I think do a good job of sort of defining the landscape, sort of the conceptual language that is used by different people in this marginalized community to talk about their own experiences, how people not a part of the marginalized community have talked about the disabled experience. And I think it's just a good overall grounding in a lot of the relevant themes that I am sure will continue to be built on as I continue this journey, but so far I have found that to be a very helpful summary of kind of my initial exploration. And I will just say, as somebody who is starting to explore their own identity as a disabled person, I think I particularly found the components about the psychological model very indicting to my own sense of that if I could only do X, then my disability would go away. I know in my head that's not true. I have an autoimmune disease that is not curable, so there's literally nothing I could do to make it go away. But I think that I have such a deeply ingrained ableist idea about disability that I find myself thinking like, oh, if I just find the right, combination of what I'm eating, that'll manage my symptoms. Or if I don't know, find the right doctor, find the right medicine or whatever, that it'll just, it's basically my fault that I haven't found the right combination of things to relieve society of me being a burden upon it in some way, either directly or indirectly. So I found this to be very helpful in starting to put words to my own internalized ableism, and then also to start to have reflection about my ableism towards other people. So with that in mind, let's move to part two. Part two is, I think that a big part of starting to educate yourself is just hearing about people's experiences. Now, we definitely get some of that in Amanda Leduc's book. I think this is more of a kind of theoretical book though, or at least that's sort of where the emphasis is. of the syllables of what is portrayed in here. But I think that Disability Visibility is a great example of a collection of stories from individuals' perspectives. And I think having read this after I read some of that theoretical grounding, it helped me identify my own responses to these stories, as well as, understand where each of these individuals seem to be writing in terms of their own experience of their marginalization. So this is a collection with a bunch of different writers. I'm not sure how many. Okay, it's not numbered. Let's say roughly 30 different stories from people, or essays from people reflecting on their own experience of being disabled. And there is a really wide variety in this book of different kinds of disabilities that are represented. Some are more physically identifiable, some are more like hidden disabilities, some are purely mental, some of them are a combination of mental and physical disability. And I think what's really powerful about this is I think if you kind of go into it with the lens of trying to identify what is your intrinsic response to some of the experiences that are shared, it's really helpful to start to identify your own ableism. I think that when you're trying to learn about a marginalized group, one of honestly the first steps that you have is to be aware of your own potential prejudice against that group in the past. Even if it was subconscious, maybe it's never manifested in any significant discriminatory behavior towards that group of people, at least that you're aware of. It may not be something that is super present in your day-to-day experience, but I think that it's really important to start to identify those attitudes in yourself. I think it also, I don't know, every time I start to learn more about marginalized groups' experiences, I find that it also usually has the effect of giving growing my own empathetic imagination towards myself. I think part of living in the world is having a lot of judgments, and we reflect those judgments upon ourselves a lot of times. And I think by trying to grow in our ability to drop those judgments towards other people, I almost always find that I'm also growing in my ability to drop judgments towards myself. So as on a purely selfish note, I think learning about these things is a growing experience for most of us as humans. But in this one in particular, I was particularly struck by reading the stories of people who had had very similar experiences to me. Even if we didn't have the exact same disability, we had some of the same experiences. And I think this really gave me a lot more compassion for myself, because I felt a tremendous amount of compassion for the people whose stories I was reading. It helped me reflect and realize that I should extend that same grace to myself. So I think that, I honestly feel like a big part of part 2 is hearing from the voices of the marginalized community themselves. So I don't want to read any specific experiences from here, but I would commend this to you to experience for yourself. Also say hello to the kitty. So once you have encountered a couple of books, the next medium that I would encourage is looking for some podcasts, or videos, TikToks, whatever, because once again, if you can seek out some from the firsthand lived experience of the marginalized group in question, I think that is really powerful and important, particularly in the case of disabled people, because there's a variety of different kinds of disabilities, there's a variety of different kinds of experiences. So I think that it once again lends credence to the essay kind of approach of this particular book, but just in general, I think seeking out a bunch of storytelling, of hearing from people in their own words and their own voices is really powerful. A podcast I particularly /video I wanted to recommend to you guys in particular is Disability, Money, and the Dangers of Wellness Culture. This was a podcast that the Financial Diet did with IMANI Barbarin, who is a TikTok creator I really, really enjoy. But I thought that this interview was particularly amazing and I thought it was very impactful. I've made a couple of videos about wellness culture kind of things, so obviously that's an angle that interests me. I think IMANI also really powerfully reflects her own experience and kind of tying into some of those hot topic items, including money, which is something that people don't always raise with respect to disability, but I can attest as somebody who now has, very expensive non-radioactive chemo treatments I get to go get every couple of weeks. It's fucking expensive to be disabled, in America at least. And so I really appreciate her kind of reflections on that.
No, and also, if you manage to get like if you're a low income person who manages to get like a little something extra, like good for you. That's like all wealthy people in corporations do 24/7.
And it's nearly impossible to game the system. In order to get a Social Security income hearing, the average wait time is 3 years. And throughout that entire time, you're supposed to have less than $2,000 to your name. And between 2009 and 2019, 100,000 people died waiting for Social Security hearings. So this idea people are gaming the system en masse is absolutely ridiculous.
So I think that that is a fantastic conversation that I highly commend to you. I will have that linked below. And then IMANI, I think in general on her TikTok does a really good job. I think she's just such a fascinating observer of culture in general. So I think her content generally is great. But I also think the kind of final element of listening to marginalized people is seeking out marginalized individuals with intersexual identities, which I think IMANI does a really great job of, particularly on her TikTok content.
Sure. So my name is IMANI Barberin. I go by Crutches and Spice online. I started my online presence around 2014 in order to just talk about being disabled and Black and a disabled Black girl. And it's kind of really grown from there, especially during the pandemic, as people started to realize just how much of their life is dictated by ableism and the way our society is set up to really fail disabled people. I really love centering disabled people in all discussions because our voices are rarely, if ever, heard. And when they are, they're kind of tamped down.
I think that that's an important part of, again, like growing empathetic awareness of understanding, okay, my experience as a disabled, wealthy, white, cis woman is very different than somebody who has compounding marginalized identities that really impacts their daily lived experience. So I think that's another element of looking for marginalized people who can also represent that aspect of what it means to be marginalized. In this case, what it means to be disabled and Black, or disabled and queer, or disabled and undocumented, or whatever. I just think that that is also an important part of learning more about a group and their experiences. So those were kind of my main thoughts about like how to learn more about a topic, and particularly I wanted to share just some of the things that I've been learning on my quest to become more aware of ableism and how it shows up in my own life and in other people's lives. I definitely am not perfect at learning about different things like this, but yeah, it's something I enjoy doing, learning more about other people and their experiences. So I thought that maybe it might be valuable for you guys to get a sneak peek into my process. Also, I'm sorry you're moving because the cat is rubbing his little face against the tripod, which is a recurring theme here on the channel. Isn't it, sweet boy? Yeah, you're such a good boy. God, I love these cats. I will say, the process of when I was first sick, when I was disabled, if I had not had these cats to keep me sane, I honestly don't know how I would have survived. So you can mess up my camera shot because you're just such a sweet boy. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that video, something a little different in terms of commentary stuff. I will link these two books below, highly recommended. And let me know if you have other suggestions of beginner-friendly resources around the topic of disabled experiences, ableism, etc. Would love for people to share resources they've enjoyed in the comments below. So I think that will do it for me. If you liked this video, like it. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe, follow me on all of my social media platform stuff. And I think that will do it for this one. I hope you're having a great day, and I will catch you later. Bye!